There are battles that decide kings, and there are battles that decide empires. But in the summer of 1565, a tiny island in the heart of the Mediterranean was about to decide the fate of all of Europe. Malta. A slab of limestone just 122 square miles, positioned exactly between two worlds on a collision course. To the west, a fragmented, fearful Christian Europe. To the east, the Ottoman Empire, the most terrifying war machine on the planet. And in May of 1565, that machine turned its gaze to Malta. What appeared on the horizon that month was not just a fleet. It was an armada of apocalyptic proportions. 40,000 Ottoman warriors, 193 warships, siege artillery capable of pulverizing the thickest walls of Christendom. And in command, Mustafa Pasha, a general who had taken fortresses from Baghdad to the Danube. Against that avalanche of iron and fire, 6,000 defenders, Knights of the Order of St. John, Maltese soldiers, civic militias, armed slaves, men with nowhere to run, defending an island they could not abandon. The math was simple, brutal. 40,000 against 6,000, a ratio of 7 to 1. The Ottomans expected victory in days. Europe expected massacre. And the defenders? They expected only the impossible. But what happened over the next 4 months would become the bloodiest siege story of the 16th century. A confrontation where the expected never happened. Where 3 days turned into 31. Where 6,000 broke 40,000. And where a tiny island halted the expansion of an empire that had conquered half the world. This is the story of the Great Siege of Malta. And it begins with a question that haunted generations. How could 6,000 hold out against 40,000 for 4 months? The answer is buried in strategy, blood, and a tactical brilliance that turned every stone of Malta into a weapon. To understand the impossible, we must first understand the inevitable. Why the Ottomans needed Malta. Why they were willing to pay any price for it. And why this little island was worth more than 100 cities. Malta was not just an island. It was a crossroads. The only strategically positioned piece of land between Christian Sicily and the Ottoman-held North African coast. Controlling Malta meant controlling the central Mediterranean. And controlling the central Mediterranean meant strangling European trade routes, isolating Spain, and opening the way for land invasions of Italy. In military terms, Malta was the lock, and whoever held the key could lock or unlock all of southern Europe. The Ottomans knew this. They had been watching Malta for decades, studying its defenses, mapping its weaknesses. And in 1565, they decided the time had come. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was in the twilight of his reign. 70 years old. Decades of unbroken conquest. But there was a blot on his legacy. The Knights Hospitaller. These knights were not just soldiers. They were a Catholic military order, founded during the Crusades, expelled from the Holy Land. Expelled from Rhodes and now rooted in Malta as a permanent thorn in the Ottoman flank. They attacked Turkish ships. They freed Christian slaves. They disrupted supply convoys. To Suleiman, they were not just enemies. They were a living humiliation. And 1565 would be the year that humiliation ended. The decision was made. The armada was prepared. 40,000 of the empire's finest warriors. Janissaries, the Ottoman elite troops, veterans of dozens of campaigns, sipahis, heavy cavalry, siege artillery including massive cannons that had toppled Constantinople's walls, mining engineers, explosives specialists, and Mustafa Pasha at the head, a man who had never failed at a siege. In the early weeks of May, the fleet sailed from Istanbul, 193 ships cutting through the Mediterranean like a living storm. And when they came into view of Malta on May 18, 1565, the watchers on the walls felt terror set in. Because it wasn't just the number of ships. It was the inevitability they carried. The sense that no human force could withstand what was coming. But inside Malta's fortifications, there was a man who did not believe in inevitability. Jean Parisot de Valette, Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, 70 years old, 50 years of military experience, a veteran of Rhodes, a survivor of Ottoman slave galleys, a man who had faced the Turks on land, sea, and in chains, and who now commanded the defense of an island everyone considered indefensible, Valette had no illusions. He knew the numbers were devastating. He knew supplies were limited. He knew European reinforcements might never arrive. But he also knew something Mustafa Pasha was about to learn in the bloodiest way possible. Numbers don't win by themselves. Not when the terrain is your ally. Not when every yard of ground costs rivers of blood. And not when the defenders are willing to turn every fortress into a tomb. The composition of the defenders was as unlikely as it was heroic. 6,000 in total. About 500 Knights Hospitaller, elite warriors from across Europe, bound by religious vows and martial devotion. 4,000 regular soldiers, including Spaniards, Italians, and mercenaries. 1,000 Maltese militiamen, men defending their homes and families. And even slaves, armed and promised freedom if they survived. Compared to 40,000 Ottomans, it was ridiculous. 1 to 7. For every defender, 7 attackers. For every Christian sword, 7 Turkish scimitars. For every Maltese cannon shot, an Ottoman barrage. On paper, it wasn't a battle. It was a scheduled execution. But Valette had 3 advantages the numbers didn't show. First, fortifications. Malta wasn't just stone. It was shaped stone. Star forts, bastions built for cannon warfare, artillery positions with overlapping fields of fire. Second, geography. Malta was a narrow peninsula. The Ottomans couldn't use their numbers all at once. They would have to attack in concentrated waves, straight into prepared defensive positions. And third, time. Every day Malta held out was one more day for European reinforcements to arrive. One more day for Ottoman morale to wear thin. One more day to turn a certain victory into an uncertain nightmare. The main fortifications were 4. Fort St. Elmo, a small fortress on the tip of the peninsula, guarding the harbor entrance. Birgu, the Knights' base town, protected by reinforced medieval walls. Senglea, an adjacent peninsula turned into an urban fortress. And Mdina, the old inland capital, a walled city that would serve as the last refuge. Each played a strategic role, and each, Valette knew, would demand impossible sacrifice. When Mustafa Pasha landed his troops and emplaced his artillery, he made a quick assessment. Fort St. Elmo, at the harbor mouth, was the first obstacle. Small, thinly garrisoned, vulnerable. Taking it would open the harbor to the Ottoman fleet, allowing direct bombardment of the main towns. His engineers estimated 3 days. Maybe 5 if the defenders were stubborn. Valette looked at St. Elmo and saw something different. He saw an opportunity. Because St. Elmo didn't have to win. It only had to hold. Every day St. Elmo stood was a day the main defenses gained to strengthen. Every Ottoman casualty at St. Elmo was a casualty that wouldn't attack Birgu. And what if St. Elmo could turn the expected 3 days into 3 weeks? The psychological cost to the Ottomans would be devastating. So Valette made the decision that would define the entire siege. He would reinforce St. Elmo, not to save it, but to turn it into a meat grinder, a place where every yard would cost Turkish blood, where Ottoman confidence would be crushed before the real siege began, where 3 days would become 31, and where thousands of Janissaries would learn that Malta would not be conquered, it would be bought, and the price would be unaffordable. The garrison of St. Elmo received clear orders. Hold. No matter the cost, no matter the time. Make every Ottoman attack cost lives. Make every assault feel like a Pyrrhic victory. And when St. Elmo finally fell, ensure the Ottomans looked at Birgu and Senglea and felt not triumph, but terror. Because if a small fort cost so much, how much would the main towns cost? Positions were prepared, cannons emplaced, troops deployed. On one side, 40,000 fighters from the most powerful empire on earth, confident of a quick victory. On the other, 6,000 defenders with no escape route, anchored on an island they could not abandon. And in the center, a small fort called St. Elmo, about to become the grave of thousands and the nightmare of an empire. Mustafa Pasha ordered the advance. His troops marched toward St. Elmo, cannons booming, Janissaries shouting, Ottoman flags snapping under the Mediterranean sun. They expected 3 days, expected an easy victory, expected to begin the true siege before the end of May. But what awaited them inside those walls was not surrender. It was fury. And the next 31 days would become the first brutal lesson that Malta would not be taken by numbers, but only by rivers of blood that not even the Mediterranean could wash away. The battle for Fort St. Elmo was about to begin, and what happened next would shock both sides, turning a 3-day fight into a 31-day massacre that would haunt the Ottomans for the rest of the siege. Because in Malta, every stone had a price, and the Turks were about to discover they didn't have enough money to pay it. 24th May, 1565. The first Ottoman cannons roared against the walls of Fort St. Elmo. The sound echoed across the island. In Birgu, just 2 kilometers away, Jean Parisot de Valette heard each blast, and he smiled, because Mustafa Pasha had made the first mistake. He had chosen exactly the target Valette wanted him to choose. Fort St. Elmo wasn't Malta's strongest defense. It wasn't where the knights kept their supplies. It wasn't where Valette had concentrated his best troops. It was a rocky peninsula with medieval walls, garrisoned by a handful of knights and Maltese soldiers. An obstacle, nothing more. Or at least that's what the Ottomans thought. Mustafa ordered the attack with absolute confidence. 3 days, maybe 5 if the defenders were stubborn. After that, his ships could anchor in the protected harbor, his troops could focus on Birgu, and the real siege would begin. St. Elmo was just a formality, a footnote before conquest. But Valette knew something Mustafa did not. Something that would change everything. Every day the Ottomans spent at St. Elmo was a day Valette gained. A day to strengthen Birgu, a day to reinforce Sanglea, a day to prepare his defenses for the hell that was coming. And if he could make those 3 days turn into weeks, if he could turn a skirmish into a bloody battle that cost thousands of Ottoman lives even before the main siege began, then the numbers wouldn't matter as much. Then psychology would become a weapon as powerful as any cannon. And then Malta would have a fighting chance. Valette called his best engineers, he called his most experienced knights, and he told them something that sounded like madness. Let's make St. Elmo hold for a month. The first days were brutal. Ottoman cannons fired without stop, pouring iron balls into medieval stone. The walls shook. Dust rose in choking clouds. The noise was deafening, a constant thunder that didn't cease even at night. But the walls did not fall, because every night, when darkness covered the island and the Ottoman guns fell silent, something extraordinary happened. Under the cloak of night, small boats slipped silently across the harbor from Birgu to St. Elmo. They brought stone, they brought timber, they brought fresh men to replace the wounded and exhausted, and they brought engineers, men who worked beneath the stars' fire, repairing holes in the walls with a speed that defied logic. Men who reinforced fortifications with compacted earth behind the stones, absorbing the impact of projectiles. Men who created impossible firing angles for the defensive gunners, turning every yard of wall into a deadly trap. When the sun rose, the Ottomans looked at St. Elmo and saw the walls intact, as if the bombardment of the previous day had never happened. It was psychologically devastating. Mustafa Pasha watched from his tent, unbelief growing like a wound that wouldn't heal. 3 days, he had said. 3 days, and St. Elmo would be theirs. But now it was day 7, day 8, day 10, and St. Elmo was still standing. Worse, every assault cost lives. Not dozens, hundreds. The Janissaries, the Empire's elite troops who never retreated, who had been trained from childhood to be unstoppable war machines, were dying on the rocky slopes of a fortress that should have fallen in an afternoon. Because Valette had turned St. Elmo into more than a fort. He had turned it into a tactical nightmare. The walls weren't just stone. They were bastions, set at angles that created crossfire zones. When the Ottomans tried to scale a section, artillery from another bastion caught them in the flank. When they tried to concentrate forces at one point, the guns of St. Elmo and Birgu caught them in a deadly pincer movement. And when, through sheer sacrifice and blood, they managed to reach the top of the walls, they found knights waiting. Men in full armor, heavy swords, and a ferocity born of absolute certainty that there would be no retreat. That every inch of stone was worth rivers of enemy blood. That Malta would not be taken cheaply. Days turned into weeks. 10 days became 15. 15 became 20. And each day, the Ottoman confidence eroded like stone under water. Mustafa Pasha summoned his commanders. He demanded explanations. How was this possible? How could a small fortress with limited resources, garrisoned by a few hundred men, resist the combined power of 40,000 warriors? The answer was simple, although bitter: ingenuity, leadership, and a deep understanding that in war, morale matters as much as numbers. Because inside St. Elmo, something remarkable was happening. The defenders were not just surviving, they were fighting with a determination that bordered on the supernatural. Valette had picked the right men, knights who had sworn to die for the faith, Maltese soldiers who were defending their families, their homes, their island. And he had given them something worth dying for. A cause, a purpose. The certainty that every day St. Elmo held was a day that saved thousands in Birgu and Senglea. That their sacrifices were not in vain. That they were making history. Valette also did something brilliant, something the Ottomans did not expect. He rotated his defenders, not all at once, but each night, some men were brought back to Birgu, replaced by fresh warriors. This served two masterful purposes. First, it kept morale high inside St. Elmo. The men knew they were not abandoned, that they had a chance to survive, that Valette had not forgotten them. Second, and perhaps more important, it created a steady stream of witnesses. Men who returned to Birgu told stories. Stories of heroism. Stories of how the Ottomans, despite their enormous numbers, were bleeding against Maltese stone. Stories of janissaries dead by the dozens, of assaults repelled, of Ottoman guns silenced by precise artillery. And those stories spread, among the soldiers in Birgu, among the civilians in Medina, across the island. Malta began to believe that the impossible was possible, that 6,000 could face 40,000. That ingenuity was worth more than brute force. That God, perhaps, was on their side. Meanwhile, on the Ottoman side, the opposite was happening. Doubt, frustration, rage. The soldiers began to whisper. If St. Elmo was costing so much, what would Birgu cost? If a few hundred defenders could cause such casualties, what would 6,000 do? Mustafa Pasha felt the psychological weight, and he made a decision that would seal the fate of the siege. He ordered full-on assaults, no sparing men, no subtle strategy, just maximum brute force. Wave after wave of soldiers hurled at the walls like tides against cliffs. He needed to break St. Elmo before doubt turned into total demoralization. The last 10 days were apocalyptic. The Ottomans attacked morning, afternoon, night, no breaks, no rest. Catapults hurled rotting corpses over the walls trying to spread disease. Turkish archers filled the sky with arrows so dense they blotted out the sun. Sappers dug tunnels under the foundations, trying to collapse whole sections of the walls with explosives. And slowly, inexorably, St. Elmo began to give. Not for lack of courage, not for lack of ingenuity, but because flesh and stone have limits. And those limits were being reached. The walls, repaired night after night for 3 weeks, finally began to crumble faster than they could be fixed. The defenders, rotated but never rested, began to fall from exhaustion as much as from wounds. Supplies, constantly replenished, but always scarce, finally began to run out. On the 28th, Valette sent a final message to St. Elmo. To evacuate or to stay was their choice. He would not order anyone to die. But if they stayed, Malta would never forget their sacrifice. The knights inside St. Elmo read the message. They looked at one another, at the broken walls, at the scattered bodies, at the sea of Ottoman troops beyond the fortifications, and they chose to stay. Because some battles aren't about victory. They're about cost, about making the enemy pay so dearly for every small win that the whole war becomes unsustainable. St. Elmo had become that battle, June 23rd, 31 days after the first Ottoman cannon fired. The Ottomans finally broke the defenses. Janissaries flooded the walls. Brutal hand-to-hand combat filled every corridor, every tower, every inch of stone stained with blood. The knights fought to the last man. No surrender, no retreat, just steel and blood, and an absolute refusal to make Ottoman victory cheap. When silence finally fell over St. Elmo, Mustafa Pasha entered the captured fortress. He walked among the bodies, looked at the shattered walls, counted the cost. Thousands of his best warriors, 31 days of siege, ammunition reserves severely depleted, and the morale of his army, once invincible, now stained with doubt. And as he looked across the harbor toward Birgu, to the reinforced walls that Valette had gained a whole month to prepare, Mustafa Pasha realized the bitter truth. St. Elmo was not the objective. It never had been. It was a trap, a masterful psychological trap, and he had walked straight into it, because now he had to make an impossible decision: withdraw, admit defeat, and return to Constantinople with the humiliation that a small fort had cost thousands of lives, or continue, attack Birgu, and risk that the cost would be even greater. Pride would not allow retreat. Logic demanded withdrawal. Mustafa chose pride. And that was exactly what Valette hoped for. Because while the Ottomans had spent 31 bloody days taking St. Elmo, Valette had turned Birgu and Sanglea into fortresses that would make St. Elmo look like a rehearsal. The walls were reinforced with packed earth and stone. Cannons were repositioned to create even deadlier crossfire zones. Supplies were stockpiled, troops were trained, and more importantly, the psychology had completely shifted. Malta's defenders now knew they could bleed the Ottomans. The Ottomans now knew Malta would not fall easily. And Valette, sitting in Birgu, watching the Ottoman standards finally raised over St. Elmo, knew he had won the first true battle of the siege. Not through military victory, but through something far more powerful. He had broken Ottoman confidence. He had proven that numbers did not guarantee victory. He had given Malta something no wall could give: hope. And now, as the summer of 1565 warmed the Mediterranean like a furnace, as Mustafa Pasha regrouped his exhausted forces and prepared the real assault, as 40,000 warriors stared at the walls of Birgu and Sanglea with a mix of determination and newly born fear, the real siege was about to begin. The Ottomans had thrown everything at St. Elmo and won a victory that felt like defeat. Now they faced the main defenses. Defenses Valette had had a full month to turn into tactical nightmares. Defenses manned by 6,000 men who now believed they could win. Mustafa Pasha looked at his troops, at the weary faces, at the wounded being treated, at the thinned ranks of janissaries that once seemed endless. And for the first time since he left Constantinople, he thought, what if we can't? But it was too late for doubts, too late to retreat. The Sultan expected victory. The empire demanded conquest. And Malta, that tiny island that should have fallen in weeks, was turning into the nightmare that would define the bloodiest summer in the Mediterranean. The summer heat fell over Malta like fire from the sky. And while the Ottomans prepared to throw everything they had at Birgu and Sanglea, while Valette inspected his defenses with a tired but confident smile, one truth was becoming clear to both sides. St. Elmo was only the prologue. The real story was about to be written, in blood, fire, and a display of strategic genius that would turn Jean Parisot de Valette from an aging commander into an immortal legend. Because Valette had more surprises waiting, more traps, more psychological moves that would turn the island itself into a weapon against the invaders. And the Ottomans, exhausted but determined, were about to discover that taking St. Elmo in 31 days was not the biggest challenge of the siege. It was just the warm-up. June turned to July. July promised August. And while the Mediterranean seethed under the relentless sun, while 40,000 Ottomans besieged Malta's last defenses, while 6,000 defenders prepared for the hell to come, one thing was absolutely clear. Malta would not be taken by numbers. It would not be taken by force. And if Valette had his way, it wouldn't be taken at all. Because he had turned that rocky island into something the Ottomans had never faced before. A living fortress, where every stone had a purpose, where every man had a reason to fight to the death, where strategic genius wasn't just theory in books, but a bloody reality that would cost the Ottoman Empire more than any conquest before. The siege of Malta was far from over, and the most brutal part was still to come. August arrived like a curse. The summer sun beat down on the island without mercy. The siege tightened around Birgu and Sanglea, and Valette knew the final battle had come. The assaults began with renewed fury. Birgu and Sanglea, the two fortified towns guarding the heart of Maltese resistance, became the target of everything the Ottomans could throw. Thousands of soldiers advancing in coordinated waves. artillery hammering the walls day and night. Attempts to scale fortifications while defenders answered with everything they had. And it was here that Valet's true genius fully revealed itself. Because he wasn't just defending fortifications, he was using the island itself as a weapon. You see, Malta was not an open plain where numbers would overpower strategy. It was a maze of narrow peninsulas, natural harbors, and rocky terrain that severely limited the Ottomans' ability to maneuver their massive forces. Birgu and Senglea occupied peninsulas jutting into the Grand Harbor, forcing attackers to bunch up on narrow fronts where numbers became irrelevant. 40,000 men can't attack simultaneously when the terrain only allows 400 on the front line. And Valet knew that perfectly. He had studied every inch of that island, every firing angle, every point where defensive artillery could create deadly zones that turned Ottoman advances into massacres. The fortifications were not just thick walls. They were interconnected systems where forts supported each other with crossfire, where angled bastions eliminated blind spots, where each section of wall had multiple layers of defense. It was military engineering adapted for the age of cannon. Medieval in construction, Renaissance in concept, absolutely lethal in execution. But technology and geography alone do not hold a 4-month siege. Not against 40,000 men determined to conquer or die trying. Valet needed something more. And he found it in his most powerful weapon, psychological warfare. Because while the Ottomans had numbers, the defenders had something numbers can't buy. Absolute purpose. They knew that if Malta fell, there would be no mercy. No retreat, no honorable surrender. There was only victory or death. And Valet embodied that reality every day. At 70 years old, he fought on the walls alongside his men, not hidden in command rooms, but exposed to enemy fire, visible, vulnerable, unshakable. When a soldier faltered, he saw his commander holding the line. When fear threatened to take over, they looked to Valet and saw absolute determination. It was leadership turned into tangible strength. The Ottomans captured Maltese flags in small victorious assaults. Valet ordered captured Ottoman flags to be displayed on the walls, visible to the entire enemy army. Ottoman prisoners were treated publicly with respect, then sent back with clear messages. We can resist indefinitely. You are bleeding to take rocks, and it was working. Because in the Ottoman camps, morale began to crack. They had lost thousands at Fort St. Elmo for a single lesser fortification. Now they faced main defenses that seemed impregnable. Supplies crossed the Mediterranean irregularly. August heat turned the siege lines into an inferno, and the defenders simply did not break. August brought the most intense assaults. The Ottomans knew they had to finish before relief forces arrived. They knew every day cost precious resources. They knew time was running out. So they threw everything they had. Massive infantry waves against Birgu, coordinated naval attacks trying to flank Senglea from the sea, artillery bombardments lasting days without pause, attempts to undermine the walls by digging tunnels, night assaults hoping to catch exhausted defenders off guard. And Valet answered each move with deadly ingenuity. When the Ottomans tried to mine the walls, the defenders countermined, creating their own tunnels that intercepted the enemy underground in claustrophobic battles lit by torches. When they attempted a naval assault, strategically placed cannons turned the harbor into a deadly zone where ships couldn't maneuver. When bombardments opened breaches in the walls, repair teams worked through the night rebuilding defenses before dawn. It was a perfectly orchestrated defensive machine. But none of that was invincible. The reality was brutal and inescapable. The defenders were bleeding too. Every assault cost lives, wounded knights who would never fully recover. Maltese soldiers killed defending their homes. Supplies running dangerously low. Gunpowder rationed. Food becoming scarce. Malta was holding. But how much longer? And then, as August burned under a merciless sun, as both sides prepared for what looked like the final assaults, something changed. Sails on the horizon, not Ottoman. Coming from the north, from Sicily. The relief force had arrived. It wasn't a massive army. Maybe 8,000 fresh men under Spanish and Italian command. But it was enough. Because the Ottomans, exhausted after 4 months of bloody siege, now faced an impossible choice. Fight on 2 fronts against reinvigorated defenders and fresh forces, or admit Malta had cost too much and that continuing would only waste more lives. Mustafa Pasha, the Ottoman commander who had promised to take Malta in weeks, looked over his decimated ranks, looked at the fortifications that still held, looked at the grand harbor where 6,000 defenders had broken 40,000, and he made the only decision that made sense: retreat. In September 1565, the Ottoman fleet weighed anchor and sailed away, not in chaotic panic, but in an organized withdrawal by an army that knew when it had been beaten. They left behind more than 30,000 dead. They left siege equipment. They left the dream of Mediterranean domination. And they left Malta in the hands of 6,000 defenders who had achieved the impossible. When the last Ottoman sails disappeared over the horizon, when silence finally replaced months of constant bombardment, Malta's defenders didn't celebrate with cries of victory. They sat in exhausted silence, because they had paid a terrible price for that victory. But they had won. So how exactly did 6,000 break 40,000? It wasn't magic. It wasn't a miracle. It was the perfect combination of tactical ingenuity, psychological warfare, and strategic brilliance executed with surgical precision over 4 months of hell. Valette used geography as a force multiplier, turning terrain into an ally that neutralized Ottoman numbers. He adapted medieval fortifications for cannon warfare, creating defensive systems that maximized lethality while minimizing exposure. He led from the front, turning command into tangible inspiration that sustained morale when all seemed lost. He made the Ottomans pay in blood for every stone of Malta. And when numbers finally mattered, when exhaustion made defense unsustainable, the relief forces arrived at exactly the right moment because Malta had held long enough for help to come. It was strategic genius turned into an impossible victory. And the consequences of that siege reverberated far beyond a small Mediterranean island. Because Malta 1565 was not just a defensive victory. It was the moment Europe realized the unstoppable Ottoman Empire could be stopped. That expansion that seemed inevitable had limits. That 6,000 men with brilliant leadership and absolute determination could break 40,000 even when everything seemed against them. Ottoman dominance of the Mediterranean never materialized. The expansion that seemed destined to swallow southern Europe met its limit on those sun-baked rocks. Malta remained Christian. The balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted permanently, and the island itself was transformed. Valette oversaw the building of a new fortified capital that would carry his name. Valletta, one of the most heavily fortified cities in Europe, built to ensure Malta would never again face an existential threat. The lessons of 1565 echo to this day. That ingenuity can defeat overwhelming brute force when applied intelligently. That leadership and morale are force multipliers that turn ordinary defenders into unbeatable forces. That strategic patience can break superior enemies who cannot sustain prolonged offensives. That terrain and technology, when used appropriately, become equalizers that render numbers irrelevant. The siege that should have ended in days became the bloodiest chapter of Ottoman expansion. And the moment Europe realized that unstoppable empires could meet their limit on small islands, defended by men who simply refused to lose. Malta, 1565. Where 6,000 broke 40,000. Where strategic genius beat brute force. Where the impossible became a bloody reality that changed the course of history. If this analysis of tactical ingenuity and strategic brilliance fascinated you, explore our playlist on history's most unlikely victories. Where intelligence defeated numbers. Where resilience changed the course of empires. Where history repeatedly proved that the impossible is just a matter of perspective.